please.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, I will be extremely short. It doesn't preclude the opposition members to use a 1064, just like when we operate in other committees. They can call a 1064 if they want to on January 1st, January 2nd. I don't care about that. It's just we need warning times, and we've had this discussion before, and unfortunately I have to put guardrails around your chair, but I know you have a job to do, and we all have a job to do, but this is why, the rationale as to why we've moved this forward. Thank you.
I'm actually going to consult the clerk, because you're now adding to your motion, and then I'm going to go to the next speaker. Ms. Khalid, yes, you're down a few spots. Point of order, yes.
I don't think that Mr. Drouin has added anything to the motion. The word of the motion remains the same. I think he's just explaining the context of it, and I think that there's nothing really to consult here.
No,
I'm hoping that we can
I'll come back to you in a
call the
second,
vote
please.
and
Thank you,
move
Ms.
on
Khalid.
with our business of the day.
What did I add?
So he's saying notwithstanding on 10. Motion's in order. Thank you, Mr. Drouin. Mr. McCauley, you have the floor, please.
And I should use my time to rail at our witnesses, and then you can just get back to us later. No, I won't do that. I have to express my extreme disappointment with the government, and I understand what they're trying to do here, which is what we've seen in the past from this, the Liberals' guillotine motion to stop us from studying the various scandals that this government has been involved in. This issue we have before us today about the so-called late meeting for the public accounts is solely on the government. This is, from what I have seen, the latest that we have actually had a tabling of the public accounts in history, and I advise anyone or welcome anyone to send me an email or a text if I am wrong. I've had the Library of Canada look into this, and we've had December tablings before, but never this late, also on basically the final day of the House of Commons. If it wasn't tabled yesterday, there is a legal requirement to have it done by the 31st, but the House isn't sitting then. We would actually be having the public accounts tabled in the House at the end of January. As it is, I think it's 261 days after year end. For those, for the 3 or 4 people watching at home, hi, Mom. And I'm sure the other 2 is my wife and one of my 2 sons, because one of my other sons has a better life, better things to do. Canada's fiscal year end is March 31st, and we're now into December. The Toronto Stock Exchange, TMX, TSX, requires any publicly listed company to have their accounts publicized. I think it's within 30 days. If the government of Canada was on the TXS, we would be delisted for not having the accounts open. And why is this important? Well, several reasons. One is accountability, but parliamentarians are asked and tasked to vote on expenditures. We just had supplementary estimates come out. It was $26 billion, and we were asked to vote on these before we even knew if there was any money in the bank. Whether we were told, it was like going to, imagine like going to a bank and asking for a mortgage for $20 million for a house, but telling the bank, you have to tell me yes or no before I'll tell you if I have a job or if I have money in the bank or finances or the ability to pay that. And that's what the government has done with the delays of the public accounts. The supplementary estimates were reported, I think, 2 weeks ago, $26 billion forced to vote on before we found out the government blew 55% past their previous guardrail. Fired Deputy Leader and fired Finance Minister Chrystia Freelands has stated that was our $40 billion deficit was our guardrail. We would not go past it. It had as much credibility as Barack Obama in Syria drawing his red line in the sand about chemical weapons. Oh, went over that. Well, here's a new line in the sand over slaughtering Kurds. Oh, line in the sand. They blew by it. We voted on it after being assured repeatedly that we would not go past a $40 billion deficit. And yet, what was the deficit when we actually found out yesterday, weeks after we approved the supplementary spending? $61 billion. We should have had this information long ago. And for us now to actually ask to work an extra day in the House of Commons to examine this money, the $61 billion, spending $21 billion blown past, and the Liberals say, no, it's inconvenient for us, we shouldn't be doing it. I'm happy to work day. I'd rather be back home. I had meetings planned in another city today that I've had to blow off again, but this is important. $21 billion. The Canadian dollar is cratering. It's lost 4 cents. If anyone around the table is heading, or the 3 people, maybe 4 now, watching at home are heading to the States over Christmas, the dollar's cratered 4 cents already in the last couple months. Now we have a financial crisis we have a finance minister. Well, maybe we don't. Well, maybe it's Francois Champagne. Well, maybe it's not. Well, who's next up? Randy Boissenault. Like, how bad is the government that they don't even know before they're firing their finance minister to have the next one lined up? Apparently Mark Carney was lined up. And you have to ask, like, this is twice that he's gone to the altar, apparently, and then no-showed. How many more times is the government going to plan a wedding for Mark Carney just to have him show up and leave all the guests at the table waiting and wondering at the church what's going on with them? But it's like they couldn't even update the required succession planning for who the finance minister is. Okay, maybe they couldn't have put publicly on their website that it was Mark Carney because they had to hide it from Ms. Freeland at the time. But surely, like, why was Randy Boissenault on that? The disgraced former EDC or ESDC minister.
Yes, Ms. Khalid?
I believe that the debate is specifically on scheduling the meetings from tomorrow onwards to January 26th, so I question the relevance.
He is well within his right. This is relevant, and it is not repetitive, and he's not reading. Mr. McCauley, you have the floor.
Thanks. But again, you have to wonder, okay, we knew Friday, the government knew Friday that they were going to fire the finance minister at the time, and okay, except Mr. Forbes wasn't told, and he wasn't preparing the transition binder, which you think they would plan a bit better when we're in a crisis right now, financial crisis, the dollar's cratering, and then we have Trump south of the border threatening 25% tariffs if we don't get our act together on the border and other issues and defense spending.
Point of order, Mr. Chair. Just out of politeness for our witnesses, is Mr. McCauley planning to go on
Mr.
until 1 o'clock?
This is not a point of
No,
order.
but I know,
this
but let's-
meeting is blown up because of you. Do not attempt to pin it on Mr.
Because of you, buddy.
Mr. McCauley. So,
24 hours, man.
Mr. McCauley, you have the floor, please.
I am shocked that Mr. Duran would deprive our witnesses of my Christmas offering to them of oh, I've got lots of free advice and lots of questions. But in getting back for the third time, which again the government has listed on their website, finance minister unavailable, listed the industry minister, who of course is embroiled in the green slush fund as well. And if Canadians are wondering what that is, that's what's tied up Parliament, I think, for 10 weeks now, where the government is, this committee has ordered, Parliament has ordered documents regarding the Green Slush Fund, specifically around Minister Champagne and his predecessor, to be tabled, and the government's blocking it. So the minister embroiled in the slush fund is next on the list to deliver the full economic statement. He, of course, famously refused. A, I don't blame him. B, I just find it curious. But who was next on the list was Randy Boissenault. And I have to question the competence. Like, surely someone would have said, who's next on the list after Minister Champagne? Surely someone. There's a lot of people in finance, a lot of people in the government, a lot of paid political staffers, a lot of exempt staffers. Surely someone should have said, hey, isn't this the same Randy that just got thrown out of cabinet for falsely claiming Indigenous status? Of course, someone would have said, Well, actually, he was thrown out of cabinet for perhaps continuing his business with Mr. Anderson, or perhaps it was one of the other reasons he was thrown out of cabinet. But surely someone could have, in crisis mode, when they were going through the list, have known, maybe we should put someone else up on the list. There are some qualified members even at this table who could have read the fall economic statement quite competently. And I mean that sincerely. But surely someone, no, I think you could have, sir. But seriously, like,
I mean, I know.
but maybe other Randy's sitting in Edmonton Centre enjoying his last few months before the election, where before he gets thrown out, thinking, "Hey, I'm next. I'm back in cabinet." But no, Randy, you're not. Instead, what happened? I think it was the Miss Gould. No, and I agree with Mr. Durant. He's saying don't measure the windows for curtains before the election happening, but I'm pretty sure I can safely state that Edmonton Centre will not be returning Mr. Boissenault to the House of Commons. Sorry, Randy, if you're watching, but there's guessing, there's hoping, and then there's reality, and that's just the reality, I'm afraid. But again, what ended up happening? We had, I think, it was the Liberal House Leader ended up coming in with a fall economic statement, dropping it, and then fleeing. So we didn't have an attempt to actually address the fall economic statement. But getting back to the public accounts, I accept some of Ms. Boudreau's comments, but we have seen a massive increase in the public servants. Surely there was a transition plan for the Comptroller General's office. Mr. Houpé left, but there's lots of people in the department who are very competent, who could have certainly achieved this in time. Where I have great lack of faith in some of the explanations is this is the same government, the same department that famously a couple years ago reopened the public accounts after they'd already been signed off on in order to stuff money back in to show perhaps a better reason. We actually ATIP'd, this is I think 3 years ago, we actually ATIP'd access information, the information around that, and we're still waiting. Some of my ATIPs will actually be eligible for pension before NDP leader Jagmeet Singh will get his pension. Maybe that's when the government will actually release those. But we have now administration government that has, for the first time since Confederation, reopened public accounts, stuffed money into the previous year, closed the accounts. Then we have this year, the latest ever, and then we hear some of the reasons why. $16 billion more put in for contingent liabilities, and I accept that the $16 billion is fully legit, but I have to wonder, April, when the budget came out, actually I think it came out after the beginning of the new fiscal year, this money wasn't in there. Like what happened in the short period between that and now where all of a sudden there's $16 billion? And that was the question I was asking, because the wording is very specifically about items that are basically assessed as likely to result. So basically what happens with the contingent liabilities, lawsuits, or other obligations, when they mature enough that, yes, it's going to result in a settlement, that's when they get put on the books. So what's happened between the budget coming out and very recently that they delayed the public accounts to be put in? I would like to actually ask the witnesses here, but of course the Liberals are blocking our ability to actually ask those questions. And again, well, I would certainly like to ask them. I would ask them right now, but I don't think they're allowed to take the floor. Perhaps they can sign up to be on this speaking order afterwards. But it's a great concern. I mean, we have late public accounts. We had commentary about the pensions for the public, the surplus. And I have great concern actually over the surplus for a couple of reasons. One, I believe the Treasury Board and the government uses a false discount rate. We actually saw some internal documents from the government about the pensions explaining their excessively high, in some people's views, discount rate for the funded portion of the public service pensions. But their explanation is we can have a high discount rate because we can take higher risks, or we take higher risks and get higher, or we get higher returns because we take higher risks. We can take higher risks because the taxpayers are on the hook for any losses. So instead of using a real return bond that we use for the unfunded portion of the pensions, I think the pre-2005 portion, we use an artificial high number, which actually perhaps hides a lot of the liability that this government has on public service pensions. The C.D. Howe Institute has guesstimated it to be about not a surplus, but an $80 billion deficit if you used real return bonds like other pensions do. And if you look at the public accounts, I haven't got them, they haven't been printed. I think apparently PSBC, Public Services, takes 2 weeks to print a book, 3 books the size like this. Chrystia Freelands managed to get her new book out in a day's notice, in 2 days in 2 chapters, but the government takes 2 weeks to print a book like this. So we don't actually have it here. It's only in PDF portion. I'd like to be able to look it up, but I can't. But I'll actually explain where what the discount rate is. But getting back to what I was talking about, my concern with the pensions, Ms. Boudreau explained that was one of the delays. My belief is, well, if the pension surplus is recognized in this fiscal year, which started April 1 of this year, then that money would be recognized in this year. It would not go into previous year. So I'm not sure why that pension money, and Mr. Canning's brought it up, and my colleague from the Bloc brought up the pension as well. We certainly like to ask those questions, but of course, the government is blocking our ability to look at that. Government's blocking our ability to look at this whole scandal of the finance minister getting turfed on a Friday, but still told she has to come back and present the fall economic statement, take the fall for being $20 billion over, and then take a new role in the cabinet where she has no staff or no power or anything to make way for Mark Carney. I appreciate Minister LeBlanc stepping up to take his role as well. Perhaps it'll make it easier for him to access Clam Scam 2 or some other favors for the family as he has done in the past. But it makes you wonder, like, we knew Friday, the government knew Friday that Minister Freeland was going to leave her role. We're in an economic crisis right now. We're into our 6th quarter in a row of GDP per capita dropping, which means the wealth generated per person in Canada is dropping. We're now at the same level we were 2018, whereas the U.S. has gone up, I think, 25%. We used to be almost even GDP per capita in this country. We're now at about 50, I think we're at 55,000 U.S., and the U.S. has shot up to 81,000. Ireland, which used to, people used to flee Ireland for economic reasons, as my great-grandparents did, now has a GDP per capita of over 100,000 U.S., and we're at 55. But I digress. We are in this economic crisis of a collapsing economy. Unemployment is up to 6.8, 6.9%. Who knows if it's going to break 7. 10% in Toronto, 8% in Edmonton. Again, 6 straight quarters. Former Bank of Canada Governor, Mr. Palaz, stated we are in a recession. We're not in a technical recession of 2 straight quarters of GDP decline. He states we are in a full-blown recession, and the numbers show it. The only thing hiding that is the out-of-control immigration growth that even the government has stated, yeah, we let go out of control and we have to cut it back. So on one hand, it's like, well, they're flooding the country with new people when we don't have housing for them, we don't have hospitals for them, we don't have doctors for them, but it's propping up the economy, the GDP, and they're hiding behind that as saying, oh, we've got the best economy in the G7.
Mr. McCauley, that was a pause. I'm going to take a minute. I'm going to very soon dismiss the witnesses. I suspect Madame Sinclair would like to speak before I do that. Would you yield I'll put you back on the list. I know you're on a roll. I don't want to interrupt you, but I do want to be respectful. So you can decline me, but it was just to.
I have so much more, but I'd be very happy to allow Ms. Sinclair Dignay
Thank you.
to sub in for for a moment.
I will move you down. I'm going to turn to Madame Sinclair Dignay, please, and then I will come back to the witnesses.
Merci pour votre générosité.
Thank you for your generosity, Mr. McCauley. And thank you, Chair, for suggesting the idea. I think it's a real shame that while we had witnesses and we had so many questions to be asking them, that a motion was moved at the beginning of the committee. Mr. Drouin, it's customary that the motions are moved in the last round to allow parties such as the Bloc Québécois and the NDP to make their points rather than encouraging a filibuster from the Conservatives. So it's really both sides of the House that don't want to see the House or the Parliament make any progress or get any work done. Even with the short notice and everything, I'm really disappointed. The subject of the motion doesn't really interest me that much because we really had the witnesses and we could be talking to them instead of doing this. So I will cede the floor back to Mr. McCauley, who will probably take us to the end of the committee today. Once again, I'd like to underline that this waste of time is really, really unfortunate, and we could have and should have avoided this. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Khalid is not in the room. I will go to the next person. That is. No, I'm going to move you down to the bottom. But, well, it's Mr. Jamil, so I will see you instead, since I'm sure Mr. Giovanni, pardon me, will be happy to yield his spot to you, Mr. McCauley.
Thank you. One thing I do want to address, besides, just how disappointed I am that we're not able to ask witnesses these questions, it's important stuff, is the motion actually blocks committee from meeting. They may claim that under 1064, which for those watching at home, maybe 5 of you now, a 1064 is a procedure that if 4 members of this committee writes to the chair, we can force a meeting, but it doesn't actually allow meetings to delve into the scandals of the Green Slush Fund, the scandal of the CEBA loan.
Mr. McCauley, sorry, just hold your thoughts. The witnesses are excused. Thank you very much. We will see you all again in the new year. I appreciate you coming in today, and I apologize
I wanted them
for
here
this
to berate them.
needless delay. Merry Christmas, yes. Mr. McCauley, you have the floor.
And as the witnesses leave, I just want to yell at them a bit more. Merry Christmas. I appreciate your attempt to get the public accounts to us before Christmas. The 1064 does not actually allow meetings into the scandals. All it allows is a meeting to decide whether there are meetings. And we could end up having 4 members from different parties sign the 1064. We could come to Ottawa, present a meeting to discuss some of the scandals, such as the Green Slush Fund, such as the finance minister getting fired right before the full economic statement, with a $60 billion deficit that is causing the dollar to drop, causing uncertainty, and as the papers say, giving a gift to Trump in his fight against us with his tariffs, because it shows us as weak and chaotic. We could just have the members of the government with their coalition partner with the NDP immediately move to adjourn the meeting. So this is a false outreach that the government will put forward. Oh, you could have a 1064 any time in January or February or break week. But it's not really true. As we saw years ago with other times we've had 1064s, we get here and the government and the coalition partners say we don't want to work on a break week. We do not want the committee looking into our scandals. We do not want a light shown on this disaster of a government. So I reject the argument, oh, we could have a 1064 anytime. We can't. The reality is the government could still simply move to adjourn that or block any meeting period, as we actually had in the past. I think on Arrive Can. So, getting back, there's one of the things, and it's unfortunate the Auditor General has laughed, because one of the issues that she brought forward in her opinion, it's actually not in the public accounts itself. You have to look online for her commentary, because the public accounts, by the way, is, I have to say, I'm very disappointed. It's gone from a audited opinion to a propaganda piece for the government. If you read some of the, I'm going to call it what it is, a lie, the government talks about the carbon tax being revenue neutral. But it is not revenue neutral. To say so is a lie. And here we have a government document signed by the Comptroller General, signed by the Receiver General, signed off, delivered by the Treasury Board, signed by the Auditor General, where you have copy, not the numbers, but you have copy, editorial, which is government talking points, in this case specifically a lie. Because the carbon tax is not revenue neutral. The carbon tax has a GST. Alberta alone would be paying, I think it's $100 million in GST just on the carbon tax. The carbon tax also does not, on a straight revenue neutral, would every penny collected from taxpayers would go to taxpayers. It actually does not. Some is diverted to government operations. I think a couple years ago, $100 million was diverted to government operations. Some is diverted to small and medium enterprises. So therefore, again, it is not revenue neutral. It is, again, being used a bit as slush fund. I've got it somewhere in my papers, and I hope to be able to refer to it. The OECD, in their description of revenue neutral, states that it is money that cannot, taxation money that cannot be used to discriminate or push spending patterns a certain way, which is exactly the whole point of the carbon tax. And I'm not arguing what the intent of the carbon tax is, which is to drive up prices one way and force habits perhaps another way toward less carbon intensive. That is the whole point of the carbon tax. But the OECD states that such actions means it is not revenue neutral. So here we have the OECD basically saying that the carbon tax, just the idea of a carbon tax, is not revenue neutral. Also, of course, we had the oil carve-out for people from New Brunswick, like our chair from the wonderful province of New Brunswick and other provinces in the Atlantic Canada, where the Liberal government cynically did a carve-out and told those in Alberta and Saskatchewan suffering through -40, we're going to tax you extra to heat your home. We're going to tax you more despite the fact you have some of the coldest temperatures in the country. But in areas where we're polling very poorly and are getting pressure from our MPs because they're going to lose the next election, we are going to give you a carbon tax carve-out. So again, it violates the whole neutrality of a carbon tax, but further violates the definition of the carbon tax as stated by the OECD. But I'm getting back to the carbon tax, and I read, the federal pollution pricing system is revenue neutral. This year, they've added a bit of a disclaimer. Over time for the federal government. Now,
Yes, Mr. Drouin.
You'll notice where I'm going. I thought there was no reading allowed during filibusterings.
I am quoting from something.
Yeah, you can cite, but yeah, so if you just bear that in, Mr. Drouin is correct. I am not saying you're reading.
No, I am.
Back to you. Yes, you can
Chair,
cite. You can. Yes,
you can cite
it as,
verbatim.
and as you're doing, continue.
Thank you very much. And before I was interrupted by such silliness, the federal pollution pricing system is revenue neutral over time for the federal government. Of course, in the House of Commons, repeatedly the government stood up and said it's revenue neutral. Previous public accounts, it's revenue neutral. Now it's revenue neutral, but over time. Perhaps the budget will balance itself over time for the federal government. You can't have an accounting number being stated as a certainty over time. It's either revenue neutral or it's not revenue neutral, and it is not. I want to continue with other points from the public accounts, and I'm happy to paraphrase them if I can't read the public accounts verbatim. One of the things it states is, government will announce that starting in fiscal 2025, the share of fuel charge proceeds returned to Indigenous governments, which is fair, but that's a policy statement, will increase from 1% to 2%. So then I have to ask, where is this extra 100% increase for the proceeds coming from? And I'm not criticizing the policy decision. They should actually back it up, because there are areas where certain Indigenous are maybe requiring a lot higher increase, more rural, further north, than perhaps southern ones. I'm thinking of the Inkami band in First Nations in BC, which has phenomenal wines, phenomenal hotel. I think they're a lot less affected. Okay, BC is not part of the backstop, but as an example, a lot less affected by cost of heating than perhaps the McLeod up by Fort McMurray. So I wish they'd actually backed it up with actual, we're going to do it from 1%, increase them from 1% to 2% based on this information, or we're going to do it based on need as opposed to we've increased it. Look at us. Look how virtuous we are. They should actually back it up. But again, where's that extra 1% coming from? It's coming from the general pool. Possibly that makes it non-revenue neutral. Further, as announced in Budget 2024, the government will return proceeds directly to small and medium enterprise businesses and provinces where the federal fuel charge is in place through Canada Carbon Rebate for small businesses, a new refundable tax credit. If you recall, this was announced several years ago. And again, where's this money coming from? If it's coming from in the year for the year, as the public account states, then how can it be revenue neutral, and where's this money coming from? And where was the money that they collected since 2019? It's several billion. It's not noted in the public accounts. It's not noted as what I can see in the fall economic statement. So is it coming from general revenues? And does nothing, of course, to address two issues, and I wish our witnesses were here so we could ask. I wish our previous witnesses from the EDC, which was administering the CEBA, I could ask them, but of course that was blocked by Liberal motions, guillotine motion as well. The government is going to return several $billions to small and medium enterprises to offset carbon tax that they had to pay, which was wonderful. Why so late? Where's the money coming from? But what happened to all the companies that have paid into it from 2019 to 2024 that have gone bankrupt or in receivership? Will they be receiving the money? For the CEBA money, are we going to have assurances that none of the money, none of this carbon tax rebate money is going to go to the many thousands of companies that have defrauded taxpayers? I think it was 1 out of every 11, so 9% of the 100,000 some odd businesses that received CEBA money were ineligible. $3.5 billion so far that we know of. It's probably a lot more. The AG believes so as well. But what assurances are we going to have that the government is not going to be sending carbon rebate checks to companies that owe taxpayers that money back? I wish I could ask, but of course we cannot. When is the SME rollout going to be? And where's that money coming from? Is it solely from small and medium enterprises? Has it been put into a separate pot of money? We don't know. One of the funny things about the payment for the carbon tax rebate, it used to be on a year-to-year basis. So money collected in a year was paid out in a year. Of course, now it's done quarterly, and of course with cash accounting, it's recorded when it's paid out. So if I get a check in the fiscal year, if I get a check, for example, April 5th, that's 5 days into the new year, but it was money collected in the past year. So that money collected will be accrued in 1 year, but the payout will be shown in the next. I believe the government has actually changed this a couple of years ago when it actually brought up in this very committee how it wasn't revenue neutral, how money was being taken by the government to fund other programs within the government. And it was actually right in the public accounts where they admitted it. And lo and behold, what happens next year? Oh, it's done on an offset. So when we asked Finance and the AG, what is the money coming in, money going out, rebated? Oh, we don't know. It's on a different calendar now because now it's collected 1 year, perhaps paid out another. Because, of course, now it's paid out quarterly for money that was collected the previous year. Did they do it to hide it? You know, there's Hanlon's razors, you know, don't attribute to malice, which is more attributed to incompetence. This time, I'm really not sure. And of course, there's the, as I mentioned, the oil heater, the heater, the cutout for New Brunswick and other provinces. There was one finance document stating that, of course, there's a huge carve-out for oil heating in Atlantic Canada. I used to live in Newfoundland. Our house was entire baseboard, electric baseboard heaters, but a lot of my, when we're looking for housing, a lot of them actually had oil heaters attached to the house or even buried. But the government said that, okay, we're going to carve out, not going to charge GST or carbon tax on the oil heating. Therefore, there's less money collected. Makes sense. Therefore, it would make sense that less money would be distributed because, of course, it's carbon neutral. Anything collected will be returned. But we have a finance document that actually stated there won't be a reduction in the rebates. So where's that money coming from? Are people in Alberta who are paying to heat their homes, paying high carbon tax into general revenue, subsidizing the Atlantic provinces? We actually asked that in finance, and they stated, no, it's only what is collected. But it's like, but we have a statement saying there wouldn't be a reduction. So you can't collect less taxes and still pay out, but apparently that's what the government is doing. I wish I could ask them. Oh, actually, here it is. Sorry, I apologize. I had it right in front of me the whole time. I am going to read a quote. I'm not reading notes. I'm reading a quote from the OECD, Fundamental Principles of Taxation. Why would I have this? Well, why wouldn't I? As I mentioned last week, I actually have a copy of the Royal Bank of Scotland analysis on flow-throughs for pricing for energy costs, because who wouldn't have that study on their laptop? Anyways, a neutral tax will contribute to efficiency by ensuring that optimal allocation of the means of production is achieved. A distortion and the corresponding dead weight will occur when changes in price trigger different changes in supply and demand that would occur in the absence of the tax. In this sense, neutrality also entails that the tax system raises revenue while minimizing discrimination in favor of or against any particular economic choice. And that is the exact opposite of the carbon tax. A distortion and corresponding deadweight loss will occur when changes in price trigger different changes in supply and demand. And I fully accept the carbon tax is meant to change demand. We jack up the carbon tax. Another increase is coming April 1. We're going to increase, I think it's another $15 a ton. It's going to be another 11 cents a liter. Its intent is to change your choice of habits or the demand for gasoline, the demand for home heating. The very fact where the taxpayers in Alberta are subsidizing extra folks in Atlantic Canada for the, can't remember the name of the heaters, the heating pumps, means that we are affecting choice and demand, because the demand in New Brunswick for heating oil will drop. The demand for heating pumps should increase again, but that's part of the plan. But it violates what the definition of revenue neutral is. So here we have the government of Canada pushing in public accounts, which is accounting. And again, you can have a different opinions on, or you can't have a different opinion on the accounting books. 1 and 1 equals 2. I actually have this argument all the time with my associate from Winnipeg North, who I take great joy in teasing, and he takes great joy in teasing me back, and we have a fun relationship that way. But I asked once in the House of Commons, he was going on about cuts to CBSA, and I pulled out the public accounts from 2016 that actually showed the Liberal government cut spending in CBSA, and they cut spending in 2017 as well. And the member from Winnipeg North got up and said, well, it wasn't really right that I was quoting statistics because these things aren't always true. And I'm thinking, well, you know, public accounts don't lie, so someone is lying. The numbers do not lie. Revenue neutral is not true, and yet the government puts it in to the public accounts. They're lying in the public accounts, misleading parliamentarians in the public accounts, misleading Canadians in the public accounts. We have a government that's reopened the public accounts for the first time in history for political reasons. We have them apparently, I think this year, delaying the public accounts till the day before the House rises to hide the fact that the deficit blew past the failed finance minister's projections, her line in the sand. Public accounts were signed off on December 9th. But the original report had, first go round, had gone, I understand, as early as September 30th to the Auditor General. We knew what the deficit was before it was tabled. But why didn't the government release the public accounts? I don't believe the false reason about the pensions, because again, Public Sector Accounting Board rules that revenue was, the surplus was realized in 24-25 fiscal year. So it would have no bearing on the past year. Zero bearing. And yet they trotted that out as a reason why the public accounts were delayed. I believe the government delayed the public accounts so that when we asked what the deficit was in November, they would not have to tell the truth. When we asked in October, they would not have to reveal to Canadians that they blew past their line in the sand. And I believe that is why when we asked last week, repeatedly, what is the deficit, that the government would not release that information. And it's very curious, again, one of the examples they used was $16 billion of contingent liability, and I accept that, but what I don't accept is what has changed since the budget was released, when they could have forecasted this, and very recently. And it's not the only thing that's very different from the budget, which again was released not that long ago, just a few months ago, and what's in the fall economic statement. And I'm going to read again. I'm sorry if I'm triggering people, but I want to read from the public accounts from 2022-2023, which is 2 years ago, which again, remember we had the $40 billion line in the sand, and we had a commitment to a declining GDP, debt to GDP. The accumulated deficit, the difference between liabilities and assets, or federal debt, stood at $1.236 billion, so 1,236 billion, so 1.236 trillion at March 31st, 2024. The accumulated deficit to gross domestic product ratio was 42.1%, up from 41.1% previous year. so it's up. The government remains committed to its fiscal anchor, reducing the federal deficit of a share of the economy over the medium term. So again, it is up. The government says we're committed to our fiscal anchor. Remember how many times the fired deputy minister stated they're committed to their fiscal anchor of 40 billion, which of course turned to be 61 billion, but they put that in the public accounts. So what's in the public accounts for this year? The accumulated debt, oh, here we go again. Accumulated debt was up from last year. The debt to GDP ratio was again up from last year. The government remains committed to a fiscal anchor, reducing federal debt. The exact same wording in 2022 public accounts. The government remains committed to its fiscal anchor of reducing federal debt. A year later, the government remains committed to its fiscal anchor, reducing federal debt. Again, accumulated debt to GDP was up. So here we have the government in its public accounts admitting that higher, they went up, but apparently higher is lower, because when you have a fiscal framework, when you have a debt to GDP anchor, when you have a line in the sand, apparently you can lie about it. You can lie to Canadians about it. The accounting numbers don't change, but you can say that somehow down is up and left is right, and apparently to the government, wrong is right. Which leads into public debt charges. Public debt charges were up $12.3 billion, or 35%, largely reflecting an increase in the average effective interest rate on interest-bearing debt, offset in part by lower consumer index adjustments on real return bonds. If you remember, I talked about real return bonds and the public service pension plan. If real return bonds is dropping, the discount rate should not be so high, but I digress. The Deputy Prime Minister states, we forecast in this fiscal year, et cetera, pushing our debt into bonds with a longer maturity ensures that Canada's debt servicing costs remain low. She repeats that in the House. And yet they state that interest payments have gone up. So how much the taxpayers lost because the government didn't invest in longer bonds as they stated they would? Argentina was able, despite their economic problems, able to float a 100-year bond. There's 50-year bonds available, and yet, despite the government stating twice or several times, both publicly in their previous fiscal update before she was fired, and in the House itself, don't have to worry about the debt charges, our interest charges, because we're buying long-term bonds. If we recall, a couple years ago, Glenn McGregor, I think it was with CTV at the time, asking the PM about the threat of very high servicing costs, and the Prime Minister looking condescendingly at him in that special tone of his. Interest rates are at a historic low, Glenn. But what happened? They didn't stay at a historic low. They went up, and we see a mass 35% increase in interest payments. I wish we had finance officials here so we could ask how much the out-of-control money printing led to the higher interest rates that led to the higher debt that somehow the government couldn't figure out. If I'm doing out-of-control money printing, and I know I'm going to be doing that, and I know it's going to be causing an inflation, you think I would also know, you know what, insider trading, I'm going to go and push our debt purchasing, bond issuing, far into the future to lock in its lowest rate possible, but of course we didn't. In just a couple years, 2022, the budget came out. Of course, the budget always forecasts out in 5 years, 4 years into the future costs. 2023, 2024, 4 years going out, they projected $152 billion in interest payments. This was not a long time ago. This was not in 1990. This was a very short time ago. The 2022 budget. We started out, again for 4 years, $152 billion in interest payments, which is a hell of a lot. The fiscal update that just came out, presented by some random Liberal cabinet minister, because I guess Randy wasn't available, $212.8 billion in interest. So interest on the debt in just for over 4 years has gone up $60 billion from the budget produced 2 years ago. Think about that. This is how incompetent this government is, that they were out $60 billion. So it's basically 60 over 152 is, 40% higher interest rates to service the debt from just 2 years ago. Came up in the supplementary estimates A. In OGGO, we asked, like, they had $2 billion for higher interest rates. And it's like, well, the A's come out shortly after the mains, which was shortly after the budget. How could you be out $2 billion to be coming to Parliament just a couple months into the year saying we need $2 billion? Because a couple months ago, we misforecasted what the interest payments were going to be. Like, is anyone in this room, anyone of the 5, 6 people watching, think 2 years ago, I'm going to be out that much? I'm going to work out the exact total. Bear with me here 2 seconds. 39%. They're out 39%. I'm sure the government is going to try and argue, well, things have changed, the economy's slowing. But the revenue, as projected 2 years ago, to the fiscal update, or the revenue increase over the 4 years was 17%, in the fiscal update, 4 years, 17%, and that budget that I'm referring to shows 16%. So they're forecasting basically the same revenue, but somehow they misforecasted 40%. All the brainiacs that we have in finance, all the brainiacs we have at Treasury Board, massive increase in amount of bodies, and yet somehow they were out by $60 billion over a 4-year period. And what the deficit, the interest payments, not just the deficit. I mean, the deficit, they were only out $20 billion on the deficit over a 1-year period. That's almost the same just in interest payments. $60 billion. We will collect maybe $200 billion in GST. So they were out like 30% of the value of the GST in just a 4-year, in just over 4 years, but just from 2 years ago. And again, this is not like turn of the century or perhaps Chrétien Martin era or Stephen Harper era or even early Bill Morneau era forecasting for it. This was the now fired finance minister herself 2 years ago, missing interest payments by $60 billion. That was actually probably the second largest line now in the budget after OAS, greater than what we're actually paying to provinces for healthcare support. So I hope people remember that when they're waiting in line for 8, 10, 12 hours at their hospitals for care, that the government could have been spending, if they planned better, could have been spending money on healthcare transfers and hiring doctors instead of misforecasting $60 billion. Now, I know Mr. Cannings and Ms. Sinclair Deguenet were talking about the public service pensions earlier. If I was a public service employee knowing it's the same people nominally in charge as this, I'd be scared silly. But good thing for them, the actual taxpayers are on the hook for public sector pensions. So even though there is a surplus, it doesn't affect the public servants one bit. Just the same as if there was a deficit, it would not affect them one bit because they're guaranteed by legislation. The same with the pre-2005 pensions, which is not funded separately as post-2005. Pre-2005 is just funded out of basically general revenue. If you look at the actuarial statement for the year, it does show the two funds separately. I think the 2005 one is underfunded by $7 billion. So that should actually even be applied to the post-2005, which actually technically would bring the surplus below the 25%. So if anything, the argument is, why is the government trying to take that $1.9 billion in surplus, and what are they taking it for? The argument shouldn't be that there's a surplus and should go back to employees or should go back to with lower payments. As there is one public servant, there's one taxpayer, there are two funds, one is unfunded, one is overfunded. Why don't they count the deficit against the surplus, as any of us would do? If you have a bank account and a mortgage, you don't say, hey, I've got $10,000 in the bank, look how rich I am if you've got a mortgage of $10 million, or $10 million. You count the two of them together. So do companies, but the government counts these two separately. So again, to my colleagues, Mr. Cannings and Ms. Sinclair Dagenais, I think the questioning should be not what are they doing with their surplus, but how are they claiming it as a surplus? The government changed the law in 2019 in the budget, changed what the surplus would be. I wish we had officials here to explain why the 2005 unfunded portion is not being counted against that supposed surplus. And again, what is their intent to do with that money? Roll it in to reduce the deficit? Was Mark Carney going to step in and say, well, that was Chrystia Freeland's mistake at $61 billion. Look, we're in surplus. Look, we found $2 billion. I wish we could find out. We could find out next week in meetings, or 2 weeks in meetings, 3 weeks in meetings, but we won't find out if the Liberals have their way. Getting back actually to the public service pension, I wish we could actually have a bit more transparency about that fund. As I mentioned, they don't actually own stocks and bonds like a lot of us think they actually have. When they declare that their fund is up X percent, it's based a bit on market capitalization and based on, I think, Kentucky windage, but not an actual firm amount. The Auditor General actually referred to it in her notes from her last public accounts report from last year, concerns about how they were working out their their valuations. The same with CPP, how they actually come up with their funding. And speaking of CPP, I wish we had the officials here we could ask again, as I do each year, about how the government works out their lowest net GDP. Because when the government talks about their net GDP, they count the CPP money as an asset, but they don't count the liabilities, what they owe to grandma, grandpa, myself in 5 years. Unfortunately, I'm that old. But they don't count the obligations. But they count the assets. And so when the former and fired finance minister would stand in the House and say, we have the best net GDP ratio in the G7, it's not, well, it's true under her formulation. And as the former deputy minister for finance said a couple years ago, it uses mental gymnastics to come up with that number. The Fraser Institute uses numbers. This is an IMF says you can use this. But when you use OECD calculations, we're actually 22nd out of 29. We're the 7th worst for debt to GDP. What brings down our debt to GDP is counting CPP. So I actually posed the question. It was Mr. Sabia at the time, was the deputy minister, and his ADM. You know, the only way you can count the CPP as an asset is if you have access to use it. And Mr. Sabia actually started, well, yes, that is. And then he caught himself because he did not want to say the truth, which is you can only count that asset, the CPP, the money set aside for seniors, paid for by seniors and their companies, not paid for by the government, but half paid for by taxpayers and half paid by their company into the fund. The only way you can count it for financial or accounting reasons, according to the IMF, is if the government could access that money for operational reasons. And that is the dirty secret about the government stating their net GDP ratio is the lowest in the G7. Yes, the U.S. is a basket case, but you can never count the U.S. out, and it doesn't take much for them to flip things around like Bill Clinton did. He actually ran surpluses. They have the ability to gear up. Germany actually, I think, when you look at their numbers, actually has a lower net debt to GDP than us, and they've just announced $100 billion in tax cuts, so they actually will be moving further ahead. But we're only net, we can claim we're only the lowest when you count the money for the CPP. I think it's $700 billion, but you don't count the liability. So anyone who's watching at home who is collecting CPP, or perhaps your parents are collecting CPP, know this: when the government talks about having the lowest net debt to GDP, it's because they are counting not what's owed to our seniors, but what is set aside for the seniors, knowing that they can only count it in accounting lingo if they have access to the CPP for operational reasons. I don't think the government's going to do that. It would be suicide, and I'm not saying the Liberals would, but they're lying to Canadians when they're saying we have the lowest debt to GDP. If we compare it to the OECD, apples to apples, we are 22nd out of 29. We are the 7th worst for debt to GDP. I see the chair's
Thank you. Yeah, Mr. Paul, I'm going to interrupt you. I just, we are out of resources, but I'm going to take 30 seconds. In the spirit of transparency, Mr. Durian, this is not out of spite. I'd already signaled this to one other opposition member. I am planning to have meetings in January. The week of January 2 over 7 and 9, and several over 20 to 23rd. You'll be receiving notices on this. So I have endeavored to work the best I can with the schedule the government has outlined on these documents.
Point of order,
and I am
Chair.
sorry they do not line up with your schedule. This meeting is adjourned.
Point of order, Chair. Yeah, right. Wonder who used